Queen Elizabeth I is famous for many things, but not producing any heirs is one of them. She went down in history as the Virgin Queen, while the throne of England passed to her cousin, King James of Scotland. This led England down a road of becoming Great Britain, as the crowns of England and Scotland were now united under a single monarch. But some believe that this could have been different. Evidence is sparse, and nothing proves this story to be true conclusively, but it is possible that Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia, proposed to Queen Elizabeth. There is no conclusive proposal to reference to show that there is any truth to this statement, but there are some more subtle clues. During the reigns of Elizabeth and Ivan, the two nations became closer than they ever were and would ever be again. Especially during the 1560s, relations were very close, and English merchants got special privileges when trading within Russia. What we do know is that Ivan sought out a military alliance with the Kingdom of England, and was increasingly annoyed that Elizabeth only seemed to be focused on the economic benefit of cooperation. During this time, a merchant of the English Muscovite Company named Jenkinson acted as the representative for Elizabeth in Moscow, and facilitated communication between the two monarchs. Then, after a brief period of more sour relations in the 1570s, Ivan sought out an English bride close to Elizabeth, trying to marry Mary Hastings. So, looking at this timeline, despite there not being any official documentation or evidence of a marriage, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that Ivan might have desired it. He clearly sought close relations to England, communicated directly with Elizabeth, and tried to marry one of her close relatives. It doesn't seem too crazy to think that Ivan might have considered directly marrying Elizabeth as well, to secure his military alliance between the two nations. So what if this did happen? What if, during the 1560s, Elizabeth committed to her marriage with Ivan the Terrible, placing the crowns of England and Russia extremely close to each other? This would be very unrealistic, since Elizabeth purposely didn't marry during her reign for many different reasons, but one of them was to prevent England from falling to another power. By marrying Ivan of Russia, she would essentially be doing just that, placing England directly into the Russian orbit, with a distinct possibility of England and Russia falling under the same monarch in the not too distant future. But nevertheless, let's explore a timeline where Elizabeth thought it beneficial to marry Ivan the Terrible for political, or more probably commercial reasons. Obviously, both monarchs still have their own kingdom to govern, which would make the marriage a bit awkward. It's difficult to believe that Elizabeth would just pack her bags, leave a deputy in charge and move to Moscow. Likewise, Ivan would certainly remain in Moscow. It would be clear to everyone that the marriage was first and foremost a political tool. But it would soon be realized by everyone that even as a political marriage, the couple really didn't make that much sense. During the War of Ivan the Terrible, he went to war several times. The most prominent of these were the wars against Sweden, Polish Lithuania and the Ottoman Empire. While England might provide some minor monetary or troop support in these wars, I don't believe we would see Elizabeth committing to sending many troops or ships to actually support the Russians during these wars. Similarly, when looking at England's foreign policy, Elizabeth would not be involved in any external wars during the life of Ivan. There was a war with France in 1561, where the final English enclave on the continent was taken by France, but English support for the Dutch rebellion and the Spanish Armada only happened in the 1580s, after the passing of Ivan. So once again, it's not like there would be thousands of Russians defending England against the Spanish Armada in this timeline. So the biggest benefactor, and probably the only reason Elizabeth may have accepted the proposal, are the English merchants. Trading benefits inside Russia provided the English with a prime position to export Russian furs, wood, grain and shipbuilding materials to the rest of Europe, providing a nice bit of income for the English merchant class. But while nice, this would not be a world-shattering economic boost. It's not like Russia was a completely untapped market of advanced riches. There is still competition from other, more nearby naval powers, other producers of the same goods, and war in the Baltic region diminishing the economic returns of the area. So all in all, I don't see the big picture history of England and Russia changing too drastically during the reign of these monarchs. The two monarchs are too proud and too far away to consistently influence each other or fight in the same wars. So there is now one big question on everyone's mind. Do they have children? Ivan the Terrible already had sons at this time, so his succession isn't based on having a child with Elizabeth. If the two don't have a child together, then after the passing of Elizabeth, James of Scotland inherits England, and for the most part, we are back in our own timeline. So instead, we are going to assume that somewhere during the reigns of these monarchs, they meet up, either in London or in Moscow, and the two get a male heir. For the sake of this scenario, let's call him Dimitri. So, somewhere in 1585, Ivan the Terrible still dies. Elizabeth and her son remain in England and face the same issues as in our timeline, defeating the Spanish Armada. Meanwhile, Theodore I, a different son to Ivan, would take the Russian throne. He was quite uninterested in ruling and politics, instead leaving most of the ruling aspect to his brother-in-law Boris. For 15 years, he would rule Russia as the Tsar, but then Theodore would die. And this is where we find the biggest difference between the timelines. Because in our own timeline, this is where the line of Rurik ended. Russia descended into the times of troubles, a succession crisis which lasted for decades, eventually leading to the House of Romanov taking the throne, the same dynasty which would lead the Russian Empire all the way up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. But in this alternate timeline, many of these succession issues may just be solved, because there is now an alternative to Theodore. The line of Rurik has not ended yet. Upon the death of Theodore, the throne would pass to Elizabeth's son, Dimitri Rurik. So let's meet Dimitri Rurik. Obviously, he didn't really exist, so everything I'm about to say is pure and utter speculation. But from his very birth, he would have been the heir to the English crown, while being third or second in line to the Russian one. It is therefore quite likely that Dimitri spends most of his time in England with his mother, speaking English as his primary language and learning about the English way of governing. Dimitri would be in his 30s when Theodore would come to pass and the position of Tsar of Russia would be given to Dimitri. Now, just because there is now a legitimate successor to the Russian throne doesn't mean that all issues are fixed for Russia. There would still be a famine a couple of years into Dimitri's reign, and there is still legitimate concern that there would be a struggle for the Russian throne, although this alternate struggle would probably be significantly less devastating to Russia than it was in our own timeline. In our own timeline, many different people claim to be Ivan's dead son, to be able to continue the line of Rurik and become the Tsar of Russia. In this alternate timeline, this obviously wouldn't be possible, since assuming that nothing drastic happens, there would be a clear heir to the Russian throne. But before we fully dive into the Russian situation, we need to discuss something else. Because only a couple of years after inheriting the Russian throne, Dimitri would suddenly be in control over the strangest nation on earth. As with the passing of his mother Elizabeth, the throne of England and Ireland would now be unified with that of Russia. This would be strange, to say the least. What this also means is that James, the King of Scotland, doesn't take the throne of England and Ireland. Where the crowns of Russia and England are now interlinked, the ties between Scotland and England are now massively weakened. So now, perhaps the most important question of this scenario has to be raised. Religion and monarchy were absolutely instrumental in both England and Russia in this period. Whatever religion the monarch followed, and the intensity with which they persecuted the other side, was massively important. The same goes for Russia. So we are in quite a difficult situation here. We can either let our little Dimitri be raised in the English Anglican tradition, making his reign mostly acceptable in England, but would also cause his questionable position in Russia to become practically unholdable. Now, it is obviously impossible to say what Dimitri would have been educated to be or what he would have chosen later in life. It does stand to reason, however, that since he was raised to be the heir to the English throne, not the Russian one, he would at least officially follow the Anglican faith. Now, as mentioned before, this would put Dimitri into an extremely uncomfortable spot, as despite his legitimate claim to the Russian throne, it is highly unlikely most people would actually support his reign, with extreme opposition from the Russian clergy. Dimitri also can't expect much support from the neighbouring nations, as the Anglican faith put England into quite an isolated position in Catholic and Orthodox Eastern Europe. If a civil war were to break out and Dimitri were to request aid from, for example, the Commonwealth, this would undoubtedly be coupled with territorial concessions for the Commonwealth, which would in turn make Dimitri even more unpopular with the Russian nobles. So this is the point where I say that realistically speaking, despite Dimitri's legal claim to both the English and the Russian throne, there is simply no way that Dimitri actually manages to hold on to the Russian throne at the very least. There would be too much opposition from both the nobility and the church, both of which would only get worse when the famine hits. So this is where my semi-realistic take on this alternate history ends, since it would be a quite boring ending to this scenario to say England and Russia go their separate ways as Russia gets taken over by a pretender. So instead, Dimitri, through a combination of internal Russian support, English money and troops, and good and charismatic leadership, manages to consolidate control over the Russian throne. Now this does come with a couple of caveats though. Dimitri would probably, either formally or informally, have to make some declarations that the Orthodox Church is off limits and is to remain intact as the only official church in the Russian Empire, and Dimitri will not try to spread his Anglican faith in Russia. But we have now done it. Our Dimitri Rurik, the son of Ivan the Terrible and Elizabeth the Great, is now the Tsar of Russia and the King of England. Where does history go from here? Well, let's begin with setting some priorities for Dimitri. Despite his English upbringing, he would still have to make a very important decision of what kingdom to rule personally. Being a king doesn't make you all-powerful, especially when you're extremely far away. Dimitri would have to choose between Moscow or London as his permanent place of residence, leaving the other kingdom in the hands of trusted advisors. Dimitri would most likely choose Moscow as the center of this new empire. This has a couple of reasons. The first, although less important, is the difference in titles. The Russian Tsardom as a title carried more weight than simply the Kingdom of England. Secondly, Dimitri's control over England was more or less secure. Of course, there could still be issues that arise there with ambitious nobles, but compared to his unpopularity in Russia, his crown in England was safe. Then finally, there are the enemies of this new state. Spain had already attempted an invasion of England, had failed, and was now on the decline on the world stage. France was involved in a continuous conflict against the Spanish and the Austrians, and the Dutch and the Scottish wouldn't dare to fully invade the English, especially as the Dutch were also still busy with fighting the Spanish. The territorial integrity of England was relatively safe. Contrarily, the Russian Tsardom had to contend with the Poles in the west, the Swedes in the north, and the Ottomans in the south, putting Russia in a way tougher position geopolitically. So, during the reign of Dimitri, we can expect England itself to be relatively self-governing, left to the care of whatever nobles and clergymen Dimitri trusts. It is quite likely that English history isn't that drastically altered in the short term, as this period in our own timeline was one of relative English isolation on the European diplomatic scene. This would be even more the case in this timeline. Meanwhile, Dimitri would be focused on his Russian holdings. He wouldn't be an ambitious ruler when dealing with his external enemies. Where he could attempt to use the combined English-Russian forces to deal a heavy blow to Sweden, for example, this would only weaken his already tenuous internal position in Russia itself. Thanks to Dimitri coming to power in Russia, Eastern Europe would become more stable, as the Commonwealth, Sweden and Russia all want to conquer each other, but without Russia's times of troubles, the inciting incident is not there. While war may still break out, it would be a lot more risky for all sides, and Dimitri would try to avoid war at all costs. Instead, Dimitri would try to focus on Russia's internal affairs. Don't expect anything radical like a change in religion, but it is very likely that Dimitri sees the many issues that Russia is facing and tries to Englishify the Russian governing structure somewhat, introducing a limited parliament, reorganizing the power of the nobility and the church, opening up Russia to the full might of the English trading company, and more. Russia wouldn't be changed overnight, but towards the end of Dimitri's reign, Russia would be extremely different from our own, although it's impossible to say just by how much Dimitri would be able to influence the Russian state. Now, Dimitri's marriage would also be significant, but for the sake of simplicity, we are just gonna assume that he just marries some Russian noblesse and got at least 2 male children. Why are these 2 male children important? Because ruling 2 separate kingdoms this far apart without a clear power dynamic is simply impossible. The relationship between Spain and Mexico, for example, was a clear ruler and conquered dynamic. Meanwhile, both Russia and England have their own institutions, nobles and churches, and they wouldn't want to intermingle on any of these aspects. Russia and England would remain fundamentally separate institutions. So, when Dimitri finally dies around 1630, he would split his empire between his sons, with the eldest inheriting Russia and the second eldest inheriting England, in much the same way that Charles V split his Habsburg Empire after his death. It is possible that, at least officially, the eldest in Russia is still the ruler over England and his brother is just ruling in his stead, but in reality, the 2 kingdoms from this point onwards have split apart. So, does this mean the end of cooperation and unity between England and Russia? Well, I think that Austria and Spain are quite a good model to see the future cooperation between these 2 states. Will they unconditionally back each other with full force in any war of issue? No. Do they still have an alliance and support each other when possible and needed? Absolutely. England would provide Russia with technical know-how in shipbuilding, while trade between English and Russian merchants would continue to be intensive. Now, I cannot predict much beyond this point, as the amount of factors and randomness when dealing with medieval or early modern Europe are just too much thanks to dynastic politics and the rule of monarchs. Does an alternate English civil war overthrow the Rurik dynasty in England? Does the Rurik dynasty in England, with the support from Russia, win the English civil war? Does the civil war never even happen because the English political scene now looks completely different? Do England and Russia reunify at some point because one of the 2 kings happens to die accidentally? I'm gonna be honest, I can't tell you. So let's instead talk bigger picture. England and Scotland haven't been unified under the same monarch, meaning that a unification between the 2 will probably never happen in a diplomatic fashion, and may only come around thanks to an English conquest somewhere way later. England would still try to colonize the Americas slowly and steadily over time, as England tries to reintroduce itself onto the European diplomatic scene, trying to contest Spanish hegemony and contain France. Meanwhile, Russia would be a different place. Trade with England would link Russia way more clearly to the European trade network, while English technology being transferred to Russia more efficiently would give Russia a better navy over time. The extent of Russia's governmental changes could also mean a stronger Russia over time, as Russia avoids years of strict absolutist rule by their tsars. Another thing that could very well happen thanks to the reign of Dimitri is the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Russian monarchy becomes much weaker, with the institution of the monarchy no longer being led by an Orthodox ruler. The Church and the Crown would probably struggle for influence continually, assuming that Dimitri's son doesn't convert to Orthodox. Of course, it's also very well possible that Dimitri doesn't try or fails to fundamentally reform Russia. I'd even say it's more likely that Dimitri fails to fundamentally change Russia, since just one monarch coming in and saying we need to do things differently usually isn't enough to radically reform an entire society. But anyways, we leave this scenario off with a way stronger Russia. Because we avoided the most devastating things that happened during the times of troubles, Russia is economically stronger and has a larger population. Russia also didn't lose land to Sweden and the Commonwealth as it did in our own timeline. We can expect Russia to do even better than in our own timeline in controlling Eastern Europe, as the Commonwealth's oligarchic monarchy grinds into a halt and Sweden simply doesn't have the population to really compete with Russia long term. So, as we go into the future, assuming the dynasty in neither country changes, both nations would remain together in a form of a brotherly bond. While not unified, the 2 nations still look to the future together. So, where do you think the scenario goes from here? Let us know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, leave a like and a comment to help us against the algorithm. Even just commenting hi helps the channel out massively. As always, to see more, press subscribe, Do not miss out on the new alternate history video that will be released every Friday. This scenario was brought to you from the Patreon, so to support more and better content, consider supporting us there.